Welcome to the Recovery Stories podcast, bringing you stories of hope, healing, and triumph over the bondage of addictions, mental health struggles, trauma, and dysfunctional family systems. Our courageous storytellers have chosen to live their journey out loud in order to show others that they don't have to suffer in silence. The stories you will hear are raw, real, and may involve graphic and triggering content. This podcast is brought to you by Promises Behavioral Health's rooted alumni community. If you or a loved one are struggling, have questions, or are ready to take the next step, call our admission center at 877-351-7504 or visit us online at www.promisesbehavioralhealth.com. Our team is ready and waiting to answer the call for help.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of Recovery Stories. My name is Patrick Custer, and I'm your host. We are so glad that you're here today and hope that you stick around for the full hour of this wonderful, wonderful story of hope and reconciliation. I'm very excited to introduce our guest today. She's got a very, very impactful story that I know that you will all get something wonderful out of. So without further ado, businesswoman, former mayor of Nashville, Tennessee, and most importantly, Max's mom, Megan Berry. Welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here with you all today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to get into this, and let's jump right in. So, I wanted to start off by asking you, what was your early life like? Here in Nashville, we've heard a lot of stories about your time during, being a mayor and things that happened with your son and what have you. But there's a lot more to Megan Berry than just that. And I would love to hear about your family life and where were you originally from? And
Sure. So I was actually born out in California because my dad was a Marine and he was stationed out there. My parents were very young, and they moved back to a small town in Kansas where they were both from called Hutchinson. And then I grew up in Overland Park, Kansas, and I have three little sisters. And I grew up in a suburban, lovely environment. Everybody went to church and worked and went to school. And my mom was a room mom, and I just had I think a fairly normal childhood as far as I can remember. So there wasn't really anything very earth-shattering. My parents were married and stayed married until I went to college, and then did eventually divorce. But that wasn't evident in my childhood at all. So I had a really nice, happy childhood.
Awesome. So speaking of childhood, when you were young, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I was desperate to be a journalist. I wanted to go to the University of Missouri and be a journalist. And we lived right on the Kansas-Missouri line. So Kansas City sits right on top. You got Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. And my mom and dad were both like, you're going to Kansas, University of Kansas, because we're not going to pay out-of-state tuition. So my journalism dreams died, and I actually went into elementary education. I graduated with a degree in elementary education. I spent about a minute in the classroom because teaching is the hardest job in the whole world. I have such admiration for teachers, and I figured out pretty fast that while I loved children, I didn't want to spend my day in a classroom. So yeah.
Wow. So beyond that, where did your profession lead you?
My life kind of had a wonderful lots of twists and turns. After I graduated from college, I worked in Colorado, and I was using my elementary education degree. I worked outdoors, and we would bring the sixth graders from the Denver school system up into the mountains and teach them how to be trappers and Native Americans. Wow. and a lot of experiential learning. But the minute that it snowed, we couldn't do that anymore. So then I basically worked as a ski bum. And then I moved and left the United States, and I went to London, and I lived in England for about 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
very cool.
And then,
leading in, what was next? Because I know that there was a big piece of working as a businesswoman. And
so when I was in London, I worked lots of odd jobs. And what I figured out pretty quickly was I needed more education. And so I applied to business school and ended up coming back, and I had gotten into Vanderbilt. So that's why I picked Nashville. And so I came back, moved to Nashville, never expecting that I would spend more than 18 months in this town. In fact, I can still remember coming in here and somebody was telling me how to get somewhere. And they're like, you want to go here and there. And then they said, Demombrian. And I'm like, Demombrian? What kind of word is that? I'm like, you mean demon brewing? Like, is that street? So I never intended to stay. And he's like,
that's so funny. Siri says it like that. Siri says
that's a
demon brewing.
I'm not shocked. So then, I was going to do my 18 months and then leave. And I met my husband here, and we fell in love and got married and had a son. And I went into business ethics, and I spent 20 years as a ethics and compliance officer in different iterations, different kinds of companies, healthcare, telecommunications, and at the same time ran for office, which was also an amazing experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is awesome. So I'm curious, working in business, clearly you had more aspirations that developed further and further. It's interesting. You talk to different people that, we all do different stuff, I guess, as life progresses. And some people have a vision that, they want to keep changing. And some people say, I just fell into that. For you, was there have you just kind of had an evolving vision for what your life would do as time goes on? Or, how did you fall into public service and the desire to do that?
Yeah, it's funny. I think like a lot of women, thankfully, a lot more young women now do actually think about public service. But a lot of women in my generation, you might have run for office in high school or college, but public service and serving in that role just wasn't really a consideration. And that was never one of mine. I didn't have some secret desire to run and be the mayor of a city someday. But what I found is that I tried to walk through the doors that were open to me. And every time I walked through one of those doors, it took me closer and closer to something I didn't even know I wanted. And the public service piece was really because I got started in my neighborhood association and Max's school. And I found out that politics are really hyper local. And if you actually want to make a difference, you need to be engaged at the local level. Local and state are huge impacts on individuals' lives. And so it was more about trying to find a way to have that impact. And then that led to the service.
Wow. Interesting. I love that. And it's definitely, I would agree with you. I think that's so true. From, where can we affect change it's right around us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's see, talking about Max, I want to know what was your greatest fear about becoming a mother? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure. So I think a lot of moms, me included, one of the things that you're always terrified about is losing your child. And I was, or something horrible happening to your child. You spend a lot of your pregnancy, I think, focused on worry about, is my child going to have a great life? Am I going to be able to provide for my child? Is my child going to have everything I want to be able to give him or her? Mm-hmm. And I had those fears, and they never changed because I wanted Max to be happy. And so as he grew, I think those wishes for him and those fears were all intertwined.
Makes sense. So follow-up question to that. What was your greatest and unexpected joy that you gained after Max's birth?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. Just the reality of this baby, and it wasn't always sunshine and roses, but Max was a pretty easygoing kid. So the joy in just having this human that you were responsible for was
Mm.
a complete unexpected joy, right? I mean, it wasn't a burden at all. It was an amazing gift, and I still feel like I definitely got the best gift when Max was born because I got Max.
That's awesome. Your answer kind of sounds like a lot of I'm not a parent yet, but a lot of my friends who have become parents recently have said kind of the same thing. It's not necessarily that you expect something different, but you don't know what the feeling that you're expecting actually is going to feel like.
Oh my God, that is so true.
So
It's true.
yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. So getting into it now, we're talking about Max. I want to know and have you tell our listeners and viewers about him and his life, and what was he like, and what were his hopes and aspirations.
Yeah, and Patrick, thanks for asking. I will tell you, I'll say this all the time. If you are a parent who has lost a child, there is nothing more just joyful than to have somebody ask you about your child. Because you don't, I mean, as time goes on and the people who surround you have children, they grow up, they hit more milestones, and you get to talk about those milestones. And, if you've lost a child, your child isn't hitting any more milestones. And, in fact, it was really interesting. I was with a young woman the other day, and she had lost a child as a very young baby, like 3 months old. And I knew that she had lost her child. And we were talking, and the day before I had been at, at the shopping mall for something, and a woman had said to me, "Hey, do you have kids?" And I said no. And I told her that, and she said, I always say yes, and I always say that I had this child, I lost this child, and she said I talk about that child, and I think that's so healthy, right? Like, I mean, I should have said yes. There was probably a combination of just, I just don't want to talk. I don't want to deal with this at the moment. But when people ask, usually my response is yes, and then I get to talk about Max. So thanks for asking.
Absolutely.
I have this thing on my neck, and actually a friend gave it to me because my name is Megan. But I put it on in the morning, and the M for me is Max and Mom. And what this does is it reminds me every day that I'm a mom still. Like, I still, that didn't stop when Max died. It's still part of who I am. I don't get to be that mom to him anymore, but it doesn't mean that part of my identity is gone, because I'll always be Max's mom. And Max, he was amazing. I'm sure every mom says that about their child. He, like I said, he was an easy baby. He was always full of delight. I still remember at Max's funeral, one of his coaches talked about Max. And he said, the beautiful thing about Max was that whenever there would be a team sport, Max played basketball and baseball and soccer, that, Max didn't want to beat the other team. He wanted to meet the other team. And that's pretty true. Max would be out there being incredibly social, to the detriment sometimes of catching that ball or paying attention to where the soccer ball was going. But that was so much who Max was. He just loved life, and he loved people. And that came with this wonderful blessing of so many people having been touched by Max in his life. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking with a young man, and I knew that he kind of knew Max. They had kind of run in the same circles. And he said, I've been waiting so I could tell you this Max story. And I said, "Oh, I love Max stories. Please tell me." And he said, the day Max died, he said, I was in Seattle with my girlfriend who lives in Seattle, has never been to Nashville, doesn't know my friends in Nashville. he said everybody's phone was like blowing up the morning that Max passed. He said, and I shared with my girlfriend, this friend we know has died, and she said, oh, she said, well, what was his name again? And she said, Max Berry, and then there was a picture because some news outlet put up a picture, and she looked at it and she said, I know him. And the kid said, no, you don't. You live in Seattle. You go to school in, California. Like, how do you know him? She said, oh, my cousin, like, met him. And we all went to a Seattle's, Mariners game,
Wow.
like a month ago. And she said, I totally know this guy. And I loved that because that is so Max, right? Like, it doesn't shock me that Max was making friends and being places that brought a lot of people into his world. And that's who he was. He's just a really easygoing, good kid. But that easygoing, good kid also came with issues. And I don't want to gloss over that. Max, for all of his social acumen and easygoingness, he also suffered from anxiety. And that's actually one of the that was kind of that was part of his substance use disorder was Xanax, and yeah.
So as you lead into that, that was one of my next questions was, can you paint that picture for us, what it looked like when substances entered the picture just as usage? Were you aware, or looking back, do you know exactly when that was?
I do. I mean, I think Max self-medicated for a while with marijuana. He started smoking pot when he was probably in, oh gosh, 8th or 9th grade would be my guess. But I have to tell you, as a parent, I wasn't that worried about it. Both, I had grown up in a time when it wasn't really that big of a deal, and most of the people I knew grew out of it, and nobody does it, so it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
So we didn't really think of it as a big deal in high school. Max wasn't a drinker, so that was more of his kind of a medication of choice was pot. When he went off to college, he again chose to continue to smoke pot, and we really again weren't that worried. But his junior year, and combination of things. My husband and I are both pretty intense type A personalities. And Max was having to, he was going to have to graduate in a year. And I think we were basically busting his chops a lot, or at least I was for sure, about what are you going to do? What kind of a job are you going to get? What's going to be your life trajectory? And I think that, and plus his own internal anxiety already kind of hit a wall for him. And I can't be sure because he was over, 18, but when, and he never would sign any documents that let us know about his health. So we can talk about that in a minute. But my guess is that Max was able to get a prescriber, a doctor, who would prescribe for him something for his anxiety, and that drug was Xanax. And Max immediately was addicted to Xanax. I mean, we could tell on the phone, like, because he was away at school. We immediately knew our child was in serious trouble.
Would you say that was his senior year that you noticed that?
His junior year.
Junior. Okay. So I just wanted to take a second and recognize something from what you were talking about. When you describe Max in general and as a kid growing up, what I hear is somebody that was outgoing and loved people and connecting with people. And what we know about addiction is that it drives us into isolation and out of connection with others, when what we long so much for is that sense of belonging and connection.
Right.
And I think, my goodness, myself and maybe many people watching or listening right now can identify with that feeling of wanting connection, but because of a piece of mental health, a tape playing over and over in our head gets in the way and causes us to stumble, and we're what we feel like is forced to find a solution, whether it be good or bad, that we cling to, that just provides us some sense of relief. And I mean, that sounds to put it in a box, what you're describing with Max, right?
Right.
And so,
and Patrick, I mean, there are people in the world who can take benzos and with
mhm,
mental health can manage with it, and actually it makes their lives better.
mhm,
But
sure,
that wasn't for my son. And I think if we had understood what Max's propensity for addiction was,
mhm,
and the intersection of this incredibly addictive drug that was
right,
going to be delivered to a 21-year-old boy who already, like, come on, their brains aren't fully formed till they're 26 anyway.
mhm,
This
mhm,
like what it was a disaster. So, I say that now upon reflection. I didn't know what Xanax was. I had no idea how addictive it was. And I didn't know until my child presented in front of me. And I immediately took him to the emergency room because he was completely in crisis. And when I got to the emergency room, I want to talk about that because there's a whole lot of
yeah,
stuff here that really is the stuff I wish I'd known than what I know now.
mhm,
For Max, okay, Max was incredibly sensitive and incredibly proud and incredibly embarrassed and
mhm,
and mortified that he had gotten himself into this. Um, and I have to be honest, I was furious with him. I was so pissed that like he was clearly high, clearly, whatever was going on with him. And I didn't know it was Xanax at the time, but whatever it was, I was pissed. So I take him to
mhm,
the emergency room and they take him back and we go, they take him into a room to hold him. And the doctor says to Max, because I'm not allowed in the room, Max won't let me in the room. Max obviously tells the doctor that he's not going to sign the form that
mhm,
will allow me to have information about his health
yep,
care. And so when the doctor comes out, he says to me, I'm really sorry. I can't tell you anything, like nothing. All I can tell you is that whatever we're dealing with is going to clear his system by 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. And that's when we're going to release him because we're going to put a hold on him right now because, danger to himself, danger, and so, but that's only going to last until 6 tomorrow morning. And then you need to have a plan.
mhm,
And it's like, a plan for what? Because I don't even know what
yeah,
we're dealing with. And he's like, I'm so sorry. I can't tell you. So Max, his shame and guilt about where he was already there, right?
yeah,
Because I got to tell you, if that doctor had looked at Max and said, you know what, I think you've got like a big tumor growing out of your head, Max would have said, give me the form, get my mom in here,
mhm,
and let's figure this out. And I would
yeah,
have been a co-partner in helping with these healthcare decisions if I if if we treated substance use disorder like something that has to be dealt with medically as opposed to a moral failing, which is how we do most of the time. And
and when I have to say, and if I can interrupt you just for a second, when you say we, it's not just, it's a collective we. It's not just the parents, and it's not just in politics. It's not just the doctors. It is, you name it, across the board. We have so much work to do when it comes to how we talk about, treat, the tone in our voice when we're when we're speaking to and about someone with substance use issues.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to kind of highlight that there, because it's not just on any one group, or just on the parents.
Right.
It's a bigger issue.
And it's because I mean, again, I'll use that we, and I'll just say me, because like I'll speak for myself. Like I didn't have the depth and breadth of understanding and knowledge. And sadly, that continues, right? So Max, I go pick him up at 6 a.m. He is furious still with me. But he also knows how to manage me, right? So, because addicts are good at that. So he manages me, and I have found him a bed that I am demanding that he go to treatment. And, here's a couple things. Like, first of all, where did I find that bed? I got on the internet the night before at 10 o'clock after I got home from the hospital. I'm Googling because even though the doctor isn't going to tell me that's what we're dealing with, I know that's what we're dealing with. I know that we're dealing with something that has to do with addiction. So, and here's my shame and guilt. I don't call anybody. I mean, at this point in time, I'm the mayor of Nashville. Like, if I had wanted to pick up the phone and probably ask some questions about resources and treatment, I probably would have had somebody pick up the phone on the other end.
Sure.
Called at 10. I didn't call my mom. I didn't call my best friend. I mean, I didn't call anybody. And Bruce, my husband, he happened to be out of town. I mean, yes, I'm on the phone to him, but we're both like, holy Hannah, like, we got to figure this out. So I find a bed. And when I pick Max up the next morning, he at least agrees in theory to go to rehab. He agrees in theory to go to this bed, but says, I'm not taking him. He's going to have some friends drive him. Sure. So,
right.
5 hours later, when he's supposed to have showed up at the place, they call me and say, he never showed up. Yeah. So I'm not shocked. What I am shocked, though, is Max still had the wherewithal because he wanted to go to another rehab facility. He had actually had his friends drive him to the airport. He had called the rehab place in Florida. He had booked his own flight, and he had gone to rehab there. So they called me, several hours later and said, hey, we have him. He's here. We need your insurance. And that's it. You're not going to hear from us again for 30 days because he won't sign the form. So,
wow.
Yeah. And for Max, because it was Xanax and because Xanax is a very nasty drug to detox off of, it was probably 3 days before Max is then transported to a hospital, because the reality is that all treatment places are not created equal.
So can I ask you a question there? You hit the nail on the head. And again, for anybody listening that hasn't been through this before, I feel like I have an important question to ask. So when you had done your research to find, you selected a treatment center, and Max says, no, I want to go, I'm going to do my own thing. What was it that are you able to pinpoint? Did you already know, was there something sketchy? Why did he want to go somewhere different than you wanted him to go to? And was there anything off the bat that said that you noticed and said, that place might not be it, but he's going to do what he wants, so I'm going to go ahead and give the insurance information. What else can I do?
I think a whole combination of all of those. So Max had a friend who had gone to this particular one before. So that was Max's, knowledge of this place. The fact that Max is presenting himself at a treatment facility, I would have given anybody my insurance card, because at this point, I'm just thrilled he's willing. After, and I didn't get a chance to do any research on it because, but there's a whole industry out there that is not really designed to do much more than just take your insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And hey, look, we had it, right? So so we actually had this wonderful combination. We had a child who was willing to go to rehab. We had insurance that could pay for it, and there was a bed. Mm-hmm. All three of those things don't happen often for families. There's huge gaps. So, I felt really lucky. Now, he's there for a couple of days before he's detoxing off of Xanax. They don't actually know how to handle that because this is really just some, no-tell motel on the side of the road in Florida. So he ends up going to the hospital where he now actually has access to a phone. And now he is on the phone to us because he's terrified.
Yeah.
So that totally shifted, but he wanted to go back to this place, and we agreed because again, he was willing, and I don't think for Max, I mean, I think it wasn't a bad thing. Like, he came out at the end of that 30 days and was committed to sobriety.
Mm.
He goes back to his senior year at college. He lives his life that year. My husband called him every day because we were convinced we would hear the same thing in his voice that we'd heard the time when he was in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
We never heard anything. So our experience with drug addiction was, we thought, done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our child has gone to rehab. He's cured. We don't have to worry about this anymore. If I knew now what I didn't know then, that we were actually looking at a lifetime of management of a condition, we would have thought so much differently. No, we didn't. So he goes back, he graduates from college, and he's doing great. And I'll take you to the day he died. So
before you do that, I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you, but this is, I think, a perfect point for me to throw this thought in there. Shame and guilt plays so much of a role in mom, dad, the addict, right? And so let me draw this line here where we're talking about Max was embarrassed. He's full of shame. He doesn't want to, like you said, when he went to the hospital the first time, and we've got to do something about it. You're in a position where, like, you don't want to call people because you don't even want to put a name to it. You just want to get help and looking outside. I mean, I think if you hadn't been the mayor, I see this happen so much with, your regular average layperson, that there's too much shame to call someone else in the first place, right, regardless of your standing in the community. And I think that's so normal. So, like, I'm, talking about all these levels of shame that we see, and it continues to play a part over and over and over. And we let it get the best of us, and the blindside us, I guess. So as you're talking about the parenthood of thinking we've, hopefully we've left it behind, that piece of shame is continuing to drive the bus, because all you want is a sense of normalcy again, for everybody to feel okay, for things to, to be fixed, to be healed, and to move forward. Because in so many other realms of life that we experience, that's possible, right? And if you've never experienced addiction in your life or with a loved one, why would you know that it's something that, is going to be around for a while? And I bring this up because I think it's such an important thing to shine a light on, that shame is there. And so many of us don't know that we let it play a role in our whole family dynamic piece until way later. The insight to identify that shame driving us is just not even possible. So, if you're a parent and watching right now, or an addict, but especially I want to talk to the parents or loved ones. What Megan's talking about here is, the piece of thinking that, because it looked one way and you feel equipped. I would just put this piece of encouragement here and say, just like she's saying right now, that you can think it looks one way, but don't let the shame of the situation keep you from continuing to ask questions, because it's relentless. So sorry, I just wanted to interject that.
No, Patrick, and you hit on something. I want to take a second to kind of rewind too a little bit. If you are a parent who has a child that's struggling, because I mean, I don't want to leave this impression that, you know, Max came home one night and there was a problem and we went to the emergency room and then he went to rehab and then there were, you know, nothing else happened until he died, right? Like, I don't want that to be the impression. There were red flags along the way that we were either willfully being blind to, thought it, based on our own experience, because we're not addicts, that it wasn't really that big of a deal, or he would get through it, or he'd outgrow it, or it was just a passing thing. And anytime you have a kid in crisis, you have a family in crisis. And I don't want to overlook that point either. And I'm not like, you know, there's lots of people who may or may not know my story, and we're not going to go into it. But the reality is that, you know, when I was dealing with Max and when my husband was dealing with Max, we were dealing with Max in very different ways. And for me, the stress and strain of dealing with what I now see was a sick child, you know, and because he was, and if we thought of it that way, gosh, maybe things would be different. But, you know, as a parent, I found a way to carve out a little piece of me that I was trying to find my own little component of happiness. It was totally wrong, and it hurt a lot of people, and I'm not making an excuse for it. I'm saying, however, that families, when they're in crisis, oftentimes parents don't make great choices, and I definitely didn't make some good choices, and so the whole family is impacted when you have a child that's struggling.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that piece. So moving forward, as you know, as things transpired, you said from there he went. I'm trying to remember where we were. So he went back, did a senior year. Dad's calling every day, thinking we're listening for the tone in his voice.
We think we're fine. We go out, we celebrate graduation, because, you know, and even now, I mean, I can look back at that and go, yeah, I mean, I don't think he was on Xanax, but, you know, Max was clearly smoking pot, and again, just being, he was, you know, he was a little out of it, but he was also, again, very good at managing me and his dad, and I think we also didn't want to believe, because we really did want him to be okay. And so we were like, oh, good, milestone. He's graduating from college. This is all great. Yep. And he's going to outgrow this, right? But like, hey, you know, so what? Like, you smoke a little pot in college, whatever. You know, you get past it. Mm-hmm. So he did. He graduates, and he starts headed back to Nashville. And I seriously do believe that at this point he is just smoking some pot. Like, I don't think he's using Xanax. He makes it to Colorado, and he's hanging. You know, he's there for a couple weeks. In fact, he even gets a job, you know, doing some outdoor labor stuff, because we basically said, you know, you need to make some money, because you're a college graduate. And
now's that time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, you know, he's working, and we get to July, and so he's been working for, you know, the better half of the summer, and he happens to hang out with some friends on you know, a lovely Saturday night. And I think that Max didn't understand that what he had gone through meant that he actually had to manage his addiction for the rest of his life. That he could not ever take Xanax again. He could not ingest hydromorphone or hydrocodone or any other combination of drugs that for you and me, we could probably ingest what he had in his system the night he died and it wouldn't kill us, but it killed him. And none of the drugs in his system were enough to kill you, right? Like, I mean, so like if the wind had just blown a different way, or, you know, the amount of Xanax he had in his system was very
wow.
But he hadn't taken Xanax, right? So, you know, his tolerance level, he had this lethal combination, and the lethal combination in and of itself, I know this sounds weird, none of those drugs in their amounts should have killed him, but they did. And I think if Max had understood, because he was a year sober, right? It was right about the year mark. I think Max thought, check that box. I'm all good. And I don't have to worry about this anymore because I'm cured, or it's not really a problem for me, or whatever Max's rationale was. I don't know because I never got to talk to him about it. But my impression is that that's probably what he thought, because that's what we thought.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's something, and I can't speak from a parent's perspective, but as a recovering addict, I think we go through the stages of grief in a way that once, and again, I'll just speak from my perspective. When I got sober, there's the piece of, okay, I finally accept that I have no control. I can't do what I've done. It has, taken my life to places I would have never wanted, all those things. But, something I refer to as the forever concept, talking about it being a chronic thing. Yes. The going through those stages of grieving that I won't be like normal people. I can't drink or use like normal people for the rest of my life, because this thing back here is chronic and it will be continuing. It's there and waiting indefinitely for me to say, okay. So many of us, when we get sober, we go through that initial phase of acceptance. We get that, what you're talking about, that year under our belt, however long. And, we never really process through that piece of radical acceptance that this is and should be forever. And, just wanted to note that he's so not isolated in this, in that experience, because I see it time and time again where, people think they're good after that first period.
Well, and I think I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound absolutely nuts. So Max, goes to rehab and comes out on the other side. I still think that we thought he's not an addict, right? I think that we still thought, oh, this was an anomaly, a bump in the road. Look, he's good now. It's been a year. Like, it's all good. And this will never be something he has to deal with. And I just want to freaking kick myself, because if I had spent more time, I think, understanding what actually we were dealing with, which I would have, if like he'd been diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic or had cancer or some chronic, as you said, condition that he was going to have to live with for the rest of his life. We would have wrapped so many resources around him to help him manage this. And we wrapped nothing around him. We gave him no resources because we didn't know we needed to. And I don't know if that would have changed our outcome, but I do like to believe that if there are parents who are listening, who you have a child, like, this is something that you've got to have them understand that they have to manage it for the rest of their lives. It is not something that you are cured from. You may never like do it again, but like you just said, it's something that you have to deal with. You can't have that drink. You can't have that Xanax like when all your friends are. You can't,
Right.
whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And thank you for speaking to that piece again, because, you know, you and I talked about before we started this, that we have so many people that watch from all different walks of life. And, you know, there is so much from this story, from your story, from Max's story, to be gained from not only loved ones of the addict, but also addicts and recovering addicts, or addicts that need to be in recovery as well. And so, you know, we will continue to address everybody and, you know, these parts of the story and highlight those things. So moving forward, you know, we're about to the crisis point, right?
Yeah.
Tell us what happened.
So Max was hanging out with friends. It was a lovely evening in Colorado on a Saturday night, and they wanted some food. And they asked Max if he wanted to go with them, and he said no. And so I like to think of him sitting on that back porch, looking up at the sky and thinking about maybe me and his dad, and the drugs that he has ingested are kicking in. And his friends are gone about 20 minutes. And when they come back, Max is overdosing. He's having seizures because that's what Xanax does to you. And if you're an addict, and they're 20-something-year-old boys, and they have no idea what to do. So they throw water on him, and they hope that that will help. But it doesn't. So they do pick up the phone and finally call 911. And 911 came pretty quick. They did give him 2 doses of Narcan, but he wasn't actually dying. I mean, he did have opioids in his system, but the Narcan didn't stop that overdose. He was dead, 45 minutes. They didn't even transport him to the hospital. He died on the back porch. And I think about those other kids that were there, and I think, oh my gosh, like these poor children who also had to experience the death of their friend, and what that's going to do to them for the rest of their lives. And Max, the drugs he had in his system were all prescription drugs. I think he had a little bit of cocaine, but like all prescription drugs. And I know he didn't have a prescription for any of them. So somebody did. And somebody didn't keep their eye on that prescription. And that is something that people who are listening and watching can absolutely do. There's an initiative here in Tennessee called Count It, Lock It, Drop It. If you are somebody who uses as part of a medical diagnosis some of these drugs, make sure you count them so how many there are, and lock them up. It may not be your family member that gains access to it. It may be a friend of a kid that comes into your house. And if you're not using them anymore, I got to tell you, when I challenge my friends to go into their medicine cabinets and find all the hydrocodone and Oxycontin that they have from like a dental procedure or their knee hurt or whatever, people have tons of scripts that they're not using. And if you aren't using them, then drop them off. You can drop them off at lots of pharmacies. Lots of police stations will take drugs. You can just, there's national drop days across the United States. But my child used somebody else's drugs, and those drugs killed him.
I think that I've heard you talk about that, and I'm so grateful that you do regularly, because you're one of the few people I hear reference that on a regular basis, that whole process. And I know my struggle was with alcohol, but even still, my deal in addiction was that I needed something to change the way I felt. So even as honest of a person I like to think that I was, I needed to feel different regularly. And this is no different than most people who struggle with addiction. You know, people know where to look in the bathroom cabinet, and there's something else in the driver's seat that takes over. It doesn't matter if they're a visitor at your house, or you're somebody's at your house and it's, your kid's friend or family member or whatever. We want to believe the best out of people, but the fact of the matter is, if addiction is at play, it is the driver, not the person, not their integrity. It is addiction. And so uh, you know it's ever so true that so many people have these prescriptions that you're talking about and couldn't tell you how much,
Right.
what it is, where it is in their cabinet right now. And so there is some real truth and power behind what you were just saying. So thank you for elevating that and continuing to do so.
Sure.
For sure. And that answered, one of my next questions, which was, in retrospect, what would you say are some helpful things to look for and some suggestions, that you would give?
So I'll go back to definitely lock up your drugs. The other thing is, although Max, it didn't help Max. If you can access, in most states now you can, there's laws that have been passed. I carry Narcan with me. I have Narcan on me all the time. It's in my purse. My purse is out of sight, but and it's the kind that's the nasal spray. And you if you ever come across somebody who is overdosing, you can save their life by giving them that shot of Narcan. And it's really easy to use. And like I said, in most states, you can get it without a prescription. You can just go to, like I went to my Kroger and got it. And I think that's important because we're seeing, well, with the pandemic, especially where we are in Davidson County, the numbers of people who are overdosing is astronomical. I mean, it's, and right now, 80% of those overdoses have fentanyl in their system. And fentanyl is a huge issue, another whole conversation to have about how we create policies and stop that flow into our communities. But just having this ability to potentially save a life, counting your drugs, and then talking about it. Oh gosh, I can't tell you how, when Max died, Bruce and I looked at each other and we knew we didn't have to wait for an autopsy to know what to know that our child had died of an overdose. We didn't know exactly what was in his system. That did take a little longer to get the autopsy, but we made the decision at that moment, after having been silent for, the year and a half where we had been dealing with Max's addiction and talked about it to no one, that we owed it to Max to talk about it, to recognize it, so that there would be hopefully a beacon for other families who might feel shame and guilt, who don't want to be seen in their communities as failures, moral failures as parents, or people who are experiencing addiction who feel like they are a moral failure, or whatever that looks like. We just knew that we had to talk about it. So we came out almost immediately and said that Max had died of an overdose, because we wanted the shame to stop.
Yeah. It's interesting that, you get, not everybody goes that route, even though it becomes, it came out in the papers, it was public, but you all chose to continue to speak about it and be open and transparent. And so much of the time, I can't tell you how often I see on Facebook or the recovering groups and everything that we find out somebody died and it's a hushed tone, that you don't see it. Nobody speaks of what the cause was. It's either understood or not understood, but it's, a young person that died, and, everybody's going, what was this? And it's too shameful for the parents to even be transparent.
Because I know, because I as a parent who has lost a child to addiction, I understand. I get it. there is a huge amount of just guilt that you somehow failed.
Mm-hmm.
As that child's parent, I go back to, when they're born, what are the fears and the joys that you have? Well, you want to give them everything. You want to safeguard them. You want them to be happy and healthy. And you failed. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. I was at a funeral pre-COVID, of a young woman who had died of an overdose, and her parents were so grief stricken, and clearly whatever is coming out of a parent's mouth at that moment, I think, is so raw. I heard her dad stand over her casket and say, if she'd just been stronger, if she just fought harder, if she'd just been a better person, she could have beat this. And this young woman was one of the strongest, best people I knew. And I think we still, if bless her, if she died of cancer, he wouldn't have stood over her
Right.
casket and said that. And that's the conversation we have to switch. We have to make this conversation about the disease that it is. It's substance use disorder. People struggle with it. They need medical help, and we have to treat it like a chronic condition.
Yeah. Well, and you all chose to, when we're talking about the after piece, clearly, I think I really admire the way that you all chose to handle it from, his death forward. But in talking about, I think you already mentioned this, but, before he passed, talking to those parents that are in the middle of the chaos and what have you, being driven by shame. I think one of the things that you've said that I just want to revisit is that I think that really unveiling and being willing to have more open dialogue and conversation about the reality of what was going on is something that is missing in so many families in this scenario, just like what you're talking about before and leading up to Max's death, because shame is so heavy. Am I right?
Yes. And I know lots of people right now who have children who struggle, and or have spouses who struggle. I mean, this isn't just a disease that affects, young people. This is a disease that affects everybody. And there's still that reluctance. And I mean, I get it. I mean, but if your spouse, like I said, I keep using cancer, and I'll take that analogy just a step further. We treat cancers, depending on what kind they are, in very different ways. Addiction is the same, and there are lots of different ways to treat addiction that work for some people, that don't work for others, and ways that do work for others that don't work for others. I do get frustrated a little bit with this idea that there's only one way to treat addiction. There's not, just like there's not one way to treat a lot of diseases.
That's right.
But I think too that when we look at the outpouring that comes from a family in crisis, and what it comes with oftentimes are, all those resources I talked about, the love, the casseroles, whatever that looks like.
Yep.
But if you've got a family in crisis, when it's talking about addiction, you shut all that off. And a family needs that support. And they don't need the shame. They need the community to step up and step around them, to help them. And, the one thing that my husband said at Max's funeral, which still to this day I absolutely believe, he said, the counterweight to grief is community. Counterweight to fighting and solving this addiction problem is community. And we have to have that, or it's never going to stop.
So true. Well, I feel like that's the answer to this next question that I have, one of the answers, but I would love to hear how you have, how are some ways that you have dealt with your grief and how you're currently dealing with the, residual grief that is still there.
It's, gosh, that first year, you just try to get through every day because it's a day that you have to live without this person in your life, and you don't know if you can, and you get to that 1 year anniversary, and you've done every Christmas and everything. You've done a Christmas, a Thanksgiving, a birthday, a Mother's Day. And for me, making it through that first year kind of gave me the strength to know that I could make it through the second year and the third year. And now we're in our fourth year, which I just, oh my God, I can't believe it. And so, I would tell you that one of the things that was really helpful for me during that time was absolutely talking about it, like, and with people who are professional, grief counselors, people who understand this process of grief, people who haven't who haven't grieved, which I honestly, most people have had some loss in their life, but for those who haven't, it's sometimes hard to relate. But I found grief counseling to be really impactful. I made a commitment after Max died that I was going to go to counseling for 1 year, and I did. And it didn't bring Max back, but it brought me the strength I needed to get through that first year.
Wow. I hear a little bit too of some similarities between stuff that helps us in recovery keep going, which is I just had to take it one step at a time. I had to make it through the first year. It's one foot in front of the other, not giving up.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it's very true. So I want to ask you, and I know that we're not going to go into focusing on this part of your story, but you touched on a little bit, how you carved out and dealt with in the family systems dynamic of dysfunction and things, that there was something going on with you. And, it was somewhat public, or very public. And you've been and chosen to be public repeatedly about it and the consequences and the trouble that it caused, both politically and within your family, the affair. And I just wanted to ask you, thank you again for your transparency there and being willing to talk about all of this today.
Sure.
That level of vulnerability is not easy. And like you and I were talking about just before this, so many family systems. I mean, we've all got so much crap. It's that nobody talks about it, right? And so, you've talked about it and you still do, and in your path and in your journey. So in your affair, what after the fact piece of advice that you would give somebody that has, made whatever decision, something that they feel so shameful and so dark, that they feel like they can never get honest or move past? What piece of advice would you give based off of your experience with that?
Well, I think that for me, being able to say, I own this, I'm responsible for this, there are no excuses. And I hear the words of what I know people say in recovery, right? Which is, I'm responsible. I mean, I may have been, have taken, what the substance or whatever, but ultimately I'm responsible for my choices. And I think that that's where we all are in life. But I'm also worthy of forgiveness.
Right.
And we all are. And so, yes, we make bad choices. We do, because we're human. And the reality is that when you hurt somebody, you say you're sorry, and you own what you did. And so I hope that I've tried to do that, and to at least, you can't ever undo the hurt that you cause other people, but you can be deeply sorry for causing it, and you can try to make amends the best way you can. And I'm lucky that I'm still married to my husband. We've been married for almost 29 years, I think now. And we've been through a lot. And our lives are like any human people that are married to each other, complicated,
Sure.
but full of love and forgiveness and understanding and grace. Um, I say
Ooh.
I say this with with the best thing that I can think of. If I leave anybody with a piece of advice, it's that my husband forgave me, but then he forgot, and that's
Mm.
grace. Because if you forgive somebody and you don't give them the next step of forgetting, you really haven't done the work that's going to help you all heal.
Yeah. I think when I responded to that as you were talking through, when you said grace, that hit me so hard. Because again, talking to no matter who's watching, whether you're a family member, you're an addict, or an addict in recovery, whatever the case may be, we all carry this shame of past decision, things that we've done. But the fact of the matter is that if you're scared of owning whatever it is, chances are that there's this thought that grace isn't there for you.
Right.
Grace, you're not worthy
Right.
of grace.
Right.
And that couldn't be further from the truth.
Absolutely.
And I think that your story is so much a testament to that. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to ask you that last question. So I appreciate, again, your vulnerability and willingness to talk about that.
Well,
so
Patrick, thank you. I mean, I will just leave. There's one, there's a Mary Oliver poem that I go back to all the time. And has this great quote in it. And it says, what will you do with your one wild life? And I don't know what I'm going to do with the rest of mine. And I don't think the people on this know what they're going to do either, but you just get one life. So try to make it your best life.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate it. This has been really wonderful. And I'm just so excited that we get to share your story on our platform today. I know it's going to help change a lot of people's lives. Yeah.
For Max.
Yes, ma'am. Well, with that, I just want to remind everybody what I always like to close out with and say that you are only one decision away from a completely different life, and it is never too late to start loving yourself.
Yeah. Amen.
So thanks for watching and listening today, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
For more information on today's episode, check out the show notes. Recovery Stories is brought to you by Promises Behavioral Health's rooted alumni community. If you or a loved one are struggling, have questions, or ready to take the next step, call our admission center at 877-351-7504 or visit us online at www.promisesbehavioralhealth.com. Our team is ready and waiting to answer the call for help. Whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please share with your friends. Follow, subscribe, and leave us a review. We are grateful for you and hope that you have been encouraged by today's episode. As always, remember you are only one decision away from a completely different life, and it is never too late to start loving yourself.